You old witch. I only put up with you because of my husband. Those were the words my daughter-in-law whispered to me while I stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes after a family dinner. The strange thing is, the words themselves didn't hurt as much as the truth hiding behind them. I paused for a moment, feeling the warm water run over my hands. Then I carefully placed the plate on the drying rack and turned toward her. I smiled. Not a fake smile, not an angry smile. Just the kind of smile that appears when a person finally understands something they should have understood a long time ago. Don't worry, I said quietly. You won't have to see me anymore. Then I walked away. Sylvia laughed. She thought I was upset. She thought I was being dramatic. She thought I was making one of those empty threats older people make when they feel sorry for themselves. What she didn't realize was that something inside me had changed forever. And within a few days, everyone sitting in that apartment would discover exactly what that meant. My name is Susan Mitchell. I am 65 years old. I spent 38 years working as an emergency room nurse. I have seen gunshot wounds, heart attacks, car accidents, families losing loved ones, people receiving the best news of their lives, and people receiving the worst. Working in an emergency room teaches you many things. You learn how quickly life can change. You learn how fragile people really are. Most importantly, you learn that when someone shows you who they truly are, you should believe them. Unfortunately, I had forgotten that lesson when it came to my own family. For years, I convinced myself that everything was fine. I convinced myself that my son was stressed. I convinced myself that my daughter-in-law was misunderstood. I convinced myself that if I just kept helping, kept giving, kept sacrificing, eventually things would get better. Instead, things only got worse. The apartment where we lived was located in Oak Hill Heights. Nothing fancy, just a comfortable 3-bedroom apartment my husband Daniel and I purchased decades ago. Back then we were young. We didn't have much money. Daniel worked construction. I worked long hospital shifts. We saved every dollar we could. Sometimes we skipped vacations. Sometimes we delayed buying things we wanted, but little by little we built a life. We painted walls ourselves, installed shelves ourselves, fixed broken cabinets ourselves. Every room held memories. Every corner contained part of our story. Then Daniel died. A sudden heart attack. One ordinary Tuesday morning. 1 minute he was drinking coffee. The next minute my entire future changed. People always talk about grief as sadness. But grief is more than sadness. Grief is silence. It's waking up and forgetting for 1 second that the person you love is gone. It's reaching for the phone to call them. It's seeing their favorite chair and realizing nobody will ever sit there again. For a long time, I thought I would never recover. Then my son Kenneth needed help. He lost his job. His savings disappeared. He and Sylvia had 2 young children. They asked if they could stay with me temporarily. Of course I said yes, their family. At least that's what I told myself. Temporary turned into 6 months. 6 months turned into a year. A year became 3 years. Then 4, then 5. Eventually nobody even discussed moving out anymore. It simply became the new normal. At first I didn't mind. I loved having my grandchildren around. Emma was 8. Ryan was 6. They filled the apartment with energy. Laughter echoed through the halls. Cartoons played on television. School projects covered the kitchen table. Those children became the brightest part of my days. I told myself the sacrifices were worth it. Even when Sylvia slowly started treating the apartment as if it belonged to her. It began with little things. She rearranged the kitchen without asking. She replaced decorations Daniel and I had chosen together. She criticized how I folded towels, how I loaded the dishwasher, how I cooked dinner. Nothing was ever direct, just small comments, tiny cuts. The kind that don't seem serious individually but become painful over time. That's an old-fashioned way of doing things. You should really organize this differently. I don't understand why you keep all this clutter. Clutter. That was her word for family memories. Kenneth never said much. That was the worst part, not Sylvia's behavior. Kenneth's silence. Whenever conflict appeared, he disappeared. Whenever Sylvia crossed a line, he looked away. Whenever I felt hurt, he suddenly found something else to focus on. I kept waiting for him to become the man his father had been. But waiting doesn't change people. One afternoon I returned home carrying groceries. As I entered the apartment, I heard shouting from Kenneth and Sylvia's bedroom. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. The walls were simply thin. Are you kidding me? Sylvia yelled. That's $12,000, Kenneth. I froze. The grocery bags nearly slipped from my hands. What happened to it? There was a long silence. Then Kenneth spoke. His voice sounded small, embarrassed, defeated. I lost it. My stomach tightened. Lost it how? Sylvia demanded. Another silence. Then came the answer. Sports betting. I closed my eyes. For several seconds I couldn't move. $12,000. Gone, not stolen, not invested badly, gambled away. The savings they had planned to use for a house. The savings they spent years building. Vanished. I quietly carried the groceries into the kitchen and pretended I hadn't heard anything. But suddenly many things started making sense. The tension. The arguments. The bitterness. Their future plans had collapsed, and now they were becoming increasingly dependent on my apartment. A few days later, I learned something even worse. Sylvia invited a friend over while I was upstairs folding laundry. The two of them opened wine and began talking loudly. At first I ignored them. Then I heard my name, honestly. Sylvia laughed. She's like a permanent houseguest who never leaves. The women laughed. My chest tightened. She owns the place, her friend said. Technically, Sylvia replied. Technically, I stopped folding laundry. She acts like she's doing everyone a favor. More laughter. Meanwhile, we're stuck taking care of her. I felt something cold settle inside me. Taking care of me? I paid the mortgage. I paid most of the utility bills. I bought groceries. I babysat their children. I cleaned common areas. I cooked family dinners. Yet somehow I had become the burden. I stood motionless outside the room and listened. Part of me wishes I hadn't, but another part is grateful, because the truth finally became impossible to ignore. Once we get our own place, I'm never speaking to her again, Sylvia said. Really? Absolutely. I only tolerate her because of Kenneth. I quietly returned to my bedroom. That night I didn't cry. I didn't get angry. I simply sat in silence. For the first time in years, I looked honestly at my life. I had spent decades helping strangers survive emergencies. Yet I couldn't admit the emergency happening in my own home. I wasn't being loved. I was being used. The next morning proved it. Sylvia entered my room without knocking. She carried paint samples. Actual paint samples. Good news? She announced. I looked up from my book. What good news? I got promoted. Congratulations. Thanks. Then she spread color cards across my dresser. I've been thinking. That sentence immediately worried me. We need a home office. I stared at her. Weh. For work. She pointed around my bedroom. This room is perfect. For a moment I thought she was joking. She wasn't. You want my bedroom? Well, yes. She said it as casually as someone discussing the weather. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was unbelievable. Where exactly would I sleep? She shrugged. The storage room. The storage room. A tiny space barely large enough for a bed. You only sleep here anyway. I stared at her, waiting for the punchline, waiting for common sense, waiting for basic human decency. Nothing arrived. Then Kenneth appeared in the doorway. And I realized he already knew. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look uncomfortable. He simply looked guilty. Which meant they had discussed it together. Mom, he said quietly, it would only be temporary. Temporary. That word again. The same word that had somehow lasted 5 years. I slowly looked around my room. Photographs, books, Daniel's old records, memories from an entire lifetime. To them it was empty space. To me it was everything. And in that exact moment, something inside me became very calm. Not angry, not emotional, calm. The kind of calm that comes right before a major decision. The following morning, I left the apartment earlier than usual. Nobody paid much attention. Why would they? After all, invisible people rarely attract notice. First, I went to the bank. Then I went to an attorney's office. By lunchtime, my entire future looked different. And for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Control. The attorney reviewed every document carefully. Then he looked at me over his glasses. Mrs. Mitchell, he said, you are the sole legal owner. I nodded. I already knew that. Your son and daughter-in-law have no ownership interest whatsoever. Again, I nodded. Still, hearing it aloud felt powerful. They've stayed because you allowed them to stay. That sentence stayed with me. Because it was true. Not because I was weak. Not because I was helpless. Because I had chosen kindness. The problem was that kindness without boundaries eventually becomes permission. And I was finally done giving permission. The attorney opened a folder. Then he slid a document across the desk, a simple white envelope. Nothing dramatic, just paper, yet somehow it felt heavier than anything I had carried in years. I stared at it for several seconds. Then I smiled. Not because I wanted revenge, because I was finally choosing myself. And I had no idea that this small white envelope was about to change everything. The white envelope sat inside my purse for 3 days before I finally used it. 3 days of silence. 3 days of watching. 3 days of seeing my family with completely different eyes. Once the truth becomes clear, it's impossible to unsee it. I noticed things I had ignored for years. Kenneth never asked how I was doing anymore. Sylvia only spoke to me when she needed something. The children still loved me, But even they had started noticing the tension in the apartment. Most painful of all, nobody seemed worried about losing me. They were only worried about losing what I provided: the free childcare, the free meals, the free housing, the free help. I wasn't family anymore. I was a convenience. And conveniences are only appreciated when they disappear. On the fourth evening, I decided it was time. Dinner at 7, I announced. Everyone at the table. Sylvia looked up from her laptop. What's this about? You'll see. Her expression immediately tightened. She didn't like not being in control. Kenneth glanced between us nervously. He already sensed something was wrong. The children arrived at 7 sharp. Emma sat beside me. Ryan sat across from me. The smell of roasted chicken filled the apartment. The same meal I had cooked hundreds of times before. The same meal everyone took for granted. For a few minutes we ate quietly. Then I set down my fork. My heart was calm, surprisingly calm. I had spent years preparing for emergencies. This was no different. Sylvia, I said. Kenneth. Both looked up. I want to talk about respect. Immediately, Sylvia rolled her eyes. That small gesture told me everything. Not guilt, not concern, annoyance. As if I were wasting her time. I continued anyway. For years I've tried to keep peace in this family. Nobody spoke. I told myself sacrifices were part of love. Still silence. I told myself helping was the right thing to do. Kenneth lowered his eyes. The room suddenly felt very small. But I've realized something. I reached into my purse. The white envelope appeared. The second Sylvia saw it, her expression changed. What is that? She asked. I placed it gently on the table. A decision. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Kenneth stared at the envelope. Then he slowly opened it. The color drained from his face almost instantly. I watched his hands begin to shake. Sylvia grabbed the papers. She scanned the first page. Then the second. Then the third. What is this? Though she already knew. It means exactly what it says. Her eyes widened. You can't be serious. I looked directly at her. I've never been more serious. The document was a formal 60-day eviction notice. The attorney had prepared everything properly. Every signature. Every requirement. Every legal protection. For the first time in years, the apartment belonged to its actual owner again. Kenneth looked stunned. Mom. His voice cracked. Please tell me this is some kind of misunderstanding. I shook my head. No misunderstanding. Sylvia pushed back her chair. This is ridiculous. Her voice rose immediately. You can't just throw us out. I can. You wouldn't? I already did. The room became silent. The children looked confused, scared. I hated that part. But children always sense the truth before adults do. Emma quietly reached for my hand. I squeezed hers gently. Grandma, she whispered. Everything is okay, sweetheart. It wasn't. But someday it would be. Sylvia slammed the papers onto the table. This is because of one argument? No. Then what? I looked directly into her eyes. This is because of years. That shut her up. Years, not days, not weeks. Years. Years of disrespect. Years of entitlement. Years of pretending I didn't matter. Kenneth finally spoke. Mom, we can work this out. I almost laughed. Work it out. That phrase only appeared when consequences arrived. Nobody wanted to work things out when I was being ignored. Nobody wanted to work things out when they planned to move me into a storage room. Nobody wanted to work things out when I became invisible. But suddenly they wanted compromise. Funny how that happens. What exactly would we work out? I asked. He had no answer, because there wasn't one. Sylvia stood up. Her face was turning red. You're punishing us. No. Then what do you call this? I paused. For a moment, I thought about Daniel. My husband. The man who built this home with me. The man who would be heartbroken seeing what our family had become. Then I answered honestly. I call it boundaries. Sylvia laughed bitterly. Boundaries. Yes. You expect us to find somewhere else to live in 60 days. I expect adults to solve adult problems. The words hit harder than I intended. But they were true. For years I had been rescuing everyone. Every mistake, every crisis, every poor decision, especially Kenneth's. At some point helping had become enabling, and I was done. The conversation ended badly. Sylvia stormed into the bedroom. Kenneth followed her. Doors slammed. Arguments started. The children sat quietly. I cleaned the dishes alone. Just like always. Except this time something felt different. For the first time in years, I wasn't cleaning up after everyone. I was cleaning up after the past. The next morning was worse. Much worse. Sylvia started her campaign immediately. She called relatives, friends, anyone willing to listen. By lunchtime my phone was ringing constantly. First my sister-in-law. Then a cousin. Then an old family friend. Every conversation sounded similar. Susan, maybe you're being too harsh. Susan, their family. Suzanne, surely there's another solution. I listened politely. Then I asked one question. The same question every time. Would you let them move into your house? Silence. Every single time. Nobody volunteered. Nobody offered spare bedrooms. Nobody offered assistance. Everyone wanted me to sacrifice. Nobody wanted to sacrifice themselves. That told me everything I needed to know. 2 days later, Kenneth knocked on my bedroom door. For the first time in years. Not because he needed something, because he was desperate. "Can we talk?" I nodded. He sat across from me. Suddenly he looked older. Tired, worried. For a moment I saw the little boy who used to run into my arms after school. The little boy Daniel adored. The little boy I thought would always remain somewhere inside him. "I messed up," he said quietly. I waited. I know I did. Still I waited, because apologies without honesty mean nothing. Eventually he looked away. "I lost more money than Sylvia knows." My stomach tightened. "How much?" His answer barely came out. $28,000. I stared at him. 28,000, not 12. 28. The room felt silent. Impossible. How? His eyes filled with tears. "Gambling." The word sounded pathetic, small, weak, yet it had destroyed countless lives, including his. I thought I could win it back. Of course he did. Every gambler thinks that. That's how the trap works. You lose. Then you chase the loss, then you lose more, then you chase again. Until the money is gone, then the trust disappears, then everything else follows. I looked at my son, really looked at him. For the first time in years, he wasn't evil. He wasn't malicious. He was broken. And broken people often hurt everyone around them, including themselves. Then he said something that chilled me. "There's something else." I felt my stomach sink. "What?" He swallowed hard. "I used your name." The room suddenly felt cold. "What do you mean?" He couldn't look at me. I took out a loan. Every muscle in my body froze. A loan using my name. My hands became completely still. "Kenneth?" His silence answered before his words did. And in that moment, I realized the disrespect, the insults, and the eviction fight were only the surface. Something much darker had been hiding inside my family all along, and what I discovered next would force me to make the hardest decision of my entire life. I didn't sleep that night. After Kenneth confessed that he had used my name to take out a loan, I sat alone in my bedroom staring at the wall until nearly sunrise. For years I had prepared myself for disappointment. I had prepared myself for disrespect. I had even prepared myself for the possibility that my son no longer valued me the way he once did. But I had never prepared myself for fraud. I had never prepared myself for the possibility that my own child could put my future at risk. The worst part wasn't the money. It was the betrayal. Money can be replaced. Trust cannot. Around 3 in the morning, I walked quietly into the kitchen and made myself a cup of tea. The apartment was silent. Everyone else was asleep, or at least pretending to be. I knew Kenneth wasn't sleeping either. People carrying secrets rarely sleep well. As I sat at the kitchen table, I found myself thinking about Daniel. My husband always had a way of seeing problems clearly. Whenever life became complicated, he would strip everything down to one simple question. What are the facts? Not the emotions, not the excuses, the facts. And the fact was simple. My son had admitted using my name. I needed to know exactly how far it went. The next morning, I called my attorney. His name was Richard Lawson. A calm man in his late 60s who spoke very little and listened very carefully. When I explained what Kenneth had told me, Richard became unusually serious. Did he specify the amount? No. Did he provide any paperwork? No. There was a pause. Then Richard said something that made my stomach tighten. "We need to determine whether this was unauthorized borrowing or identity fraud." Identity fraud. Hearing those words spoken aloud made everything feel real. By noon, I was sitting in his office. Richard helped me request copies of my credit reports. Then we contacted several financial institutions. The process took hours. By the time we finished, I felt exhausted. But nothing could have prepared me for what we found. The loan wasn't $45,000. It wasn't $30,000. It wasn't even $20,000. It was $52,000. 52,000. I stared at the paperwork in disbelief. The loan had been issued nearly 18 months earlier. Monthly payments had been made regularly at first, then they became inconsistent, then they started falling behind. Which explained why collection notices had recently begun appearing in my mailbox. Not many, just enough to make me wonder what was happening. Kenneth had apparently intercepted most of them before I ever saw them. My hands trembled as I read the documents. Richard remained silent. Finally, I looked up. "How bad is this?" He folded his hands. "Financially." I nodded. "It can be repaired." I felt slightly relieved. Then he continued. "Emotionally is another matter." That answer hurt because it was true. Over the next several days, I started paying closer attention. Not just to Kenneth. To everything. People often think investigations happen in dark rooms with detectives and dramatic confrontations. The truth is much quieter. You listen, you observe, you connect small details. And slowly a picture begins to form. I noticed Kenneth constantly checking his phone. I noticed him becoming nervous whenever the mail arrived. I noticed him disappearing outside to take calls. Most importantly, I noticed Sylvia had no idea what was happening. At first, I assumed she was involved. After everything she had said and done, it seemed logical. But the more I watched, the less certain I became. One evening, I overheard another argument. This time it sounded different. Much different. You promised me everything was under control, Sylvia snapped. And no, it isn't. It will be. I am tired of hearing that. I stood quietly in the hallway. Neither of them knew I was there. Then Sylvia said something unexpected. How much debt are we actually talking about? Silence. Long silence. The kind of silence that contains an answer nobody wants to hear. Finally Kenneth spoke. More than I told you. I heard Sylvia gasp. For the first time, I realized she wasn't part of the deception. She was another victim of it. That didn't excuse how she treated me, not even close, but it changed the situation. Because villains are easier to hate than flawed people. And suddenly the story wasn't as simple as I thought. The following week, Richard introduced me to a forensic accountant named Laura Bennett. Laura specialized in tracing financial activity. She reviewed the documents carefully. Then she asked a question nobody else had asked. Has your son ever had access to your personal records? I thought about it. Then my stomach dropped. Of course he had. For years. Tax returns, insurance paperwork, bank statements, medical records. Everything had been stored in a filing cabinet in my home office. A filing cabinet Kenneth knew how to open. Laura nodded. That would explain a lot. Over the next several days, she began assembling a timeline. The results were shocking. The loan wasn't the beginning. It was the middle. There had been credit card applications. Small ones. Nothing dramatic. Then personal loans. Then refinancing attempts. Most had been denied. A few had succeeded. Each transaction was small enough to avoid attention. Until they weren't. The pattern was obvious. Kenneth had been digging himself deeper for years. One bad decision had led to another. Then another, then another. Eventually, the lies became too large to manage. The gambling losses only accelerated the collapse. The more evidence appeared, the more one question bothered me. Why? Not why he needed money. I understood that. Why hadn't he come to me? Why lie? Why steal? Why risk everything? The answer arrived unexpectedly. A few nights later, Emma sat beside me while I folded laundry. My granddaughter was 10 years old now. Old enough to notice more than adults realized. Grandma. Yes, sweetheart. Are Mom and Dad in trouble? The question caught me off guard. A little. She stared at the floor. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. I heard Daddy say he needs the apartment. I stopped folding immediately. What do you mean? She shrugged. I don't know. When did he say that? A long time ago. My pulse quickened. Did he say anything else? She thought carefully. He said if you signed the papers, everything would be okay. Papers. The word echoed in my mind. Signed papers. Apartment. Everything would be okay. Suddenly dozens of strange conversations from the past 2 years started making sense. Comments, hints, questions about ownership, questions about inheritance, questions about what would happen if I ever moved. I looked at Emma. She had no idea how important her words were. Children rarely do. Thank you for telling me that. She smiled, then returned to her homework. Meanwhile, my mind was racing. That evening, I called Richard. The next morning, Laura uncovered something that changed everything. Not only had Kenneth used my identity, not only had he hidden massive debts, he had been preparing documents connected to my apartment. Documents I had never seen. Documents that suggested someone was planning something far bigger than a simple loan. And when Richard called me that afternoon, his first words made my heart stop. Susan, he said, I think your son intended to take the apartment. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I realized just how close I had come to losing everything. I sat frozen in my chair after Richard's phone call. I think your son intended to take the apartment. The sentence echoed through my mind long after the call ended. For several minutes, I couldn't move. Couldn't speak. Couldn't even think clearly. Surely there had to be some mistake. Kenneth had lied. He had gambled. He had used my name without permission. But taking the apartment, the home his father and I spent decades building, the home filled with every memory of our family, that was different. That crossed a line I never imagined my son could cross. Yet deep down, something told me Richard was right. Too many pieces were suddenly fitting together. The pressure to move me into the storage room. The repeated conversations about ownership. The questions about inheritance. The strange comments about the future. For years, I had dismissed them. Now they looked very different. That afternoon, I met Richard and Laura at the attorney's office. Laura spread several documents across the conference table. These are copies we obtained during our investigation, she said. I looked down, my stomach tightened. There were forms, applications, property-related paperwork, most of it incomplete, some of it abandoned halfway through. But all of it pointed toward the same goal: control. Control of the apartment. One document in particular caught my attention. My name appeared at the bottom, or at least something pretending to be my name. The signature looked similar. Close enough to fool someone who wasn't paying attention. But I knew immediately it wasn't mine. My hand began shaking. That's forged. Laura nodded. We believe so. I felt physically sick. Not because of the paper, because of what it represented. Every forged signature required a decision. Every decision required intention. This wasn't a single mistake. This was planning, months of planning, maybe years. Richard leaned forward. The good news is that none of these documents were successfully executed. I looked up. What stopped them? Laura answered. Verification requirements. For the first time all day, I felt a small amount of relief. Apparently, several institutions had requested additional confirmation. Some required in-person appearances. Others required documentation Kenneth couldn't provide. The fraud attempts had stalled. Not because he changed his mind, because he failed. That distinction mattered a lot. As we continued reviewing the evidence, another pattern became obvious. Most of the activity occurred during the same period. The period after Kenneth lost his job. The period when gambling entered his life. The period when financial pressure exploded. A desperate man had started making desperate decisions. The problem was that desperation doesn't excuse betrayal. Not when innocent people get hurt. That evening, I returned home feeling emotionally exhausted. The apartment seemed unusually quiet. Sylvia was sitting alone at the dining table. A stack of bills sat in front of her. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked defeated, not angry, not arrogant, defeated. When she saw me, she hesitated, then she surprised me. Can we talk? Normally I would have expected an argument. Instead, her voice sounded tired. I sat down across from her. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, she broke the silence. How much do you know? The question caught me off guard. About what? She laughed bitterly. About Kenneth, I said nothing. She took that as her answer. Then she slowly pushed several papers across the table. Bank statements, credit card statements, collection notices, some I'd never seen before. I found them hidden in the garage. My heart sank. Apparently Kenneth's secret life was even larger than we realized. Sylvia rubbed her eyes. I thought he was just struggling. I listened quietly. I thought he made some mistakes. She looked down at the paperwork. But this, her voice cracked. This is years of lies. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then I remembered the insults, the manipulation, the way she treated me in my own home. Compassion didn't erase accountability. Still, I could see genuine pain in her eyes. The truth had finally reached her too. That night, the biggest argument I had ever heard erupted inside the apartment. Doors slammed. Accusations flew back and forth. More secrets surfaced. More lies collapsed. Around midnight, I heard Sylvia shout something that made my blood run cold. You told me the apartment would solve everything. Silence followed. Then Kenneth answered. Too quietly for me to hear every word. But I heard enough to confirm my worst fears. He had absolutely been counting on the apartment. Maybe inheritance. Maybe ownership. Maybe some legal transfer. I still didn't know exactly how. But the apartment wasn't just a place to live. It was his escape plan. And now that plan was dying. The next morning I found Kenneth sitting alone on the balcony. He looked terrible. Dark circles under his eyes, unshaven, exhausted. For the first time in years, he looked like a man facing reality. I sat beside him. Neither of us spoke for a while. Finally, he broke the silence. When did I become this person? It wasn't the question I expected. I stared out at the city skyline. I don't know. His eyes filled with tears. I never meant for any of this to happen. Part of me believed him. People rarely wake up intending to destroy their lives. Usually it happens one compromise at a time. One shortcut, one lie, one bad decision, then another, and another, until eventually they don't recognize themselves anymore. The problem is that intentions don't erase consequences. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and I realized something important. I no longer feared him. I no longer felt responsible for fixing him. For years, I had confused love with rescue. But loving someone doesn't mean protecting them from every consequence. Sometimes love means letting them face the truth. Even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. 3 days later, the final piece of the puzzle arrived. Laura called. Her voice sounded unusually serious. We found additional emails. I immediately sat upright. Emails, between Kenneth and someone offering financial advice. My stomach tightened. What kind of advice? There was a pause. Then Laura answered, "The kind that assumes the apartment will eventually belong to him." I closed my eyes. There it was. Proof. Not suspicion, not theory. Proof. For years, Kenneth had been building financial plans around an asset that wasn't his. Borrowing against a future he hadn't earned. Spending money he didn't have. Assuming my sacrifices would continue forever. The illusion had finally shattered. And the moment it shattered, everything else collapsed with it. But the biggest shock was still coming. Because hidden among those emails was one final discovery. A discovery so devastating that even Sylvia had no idea it existed. And when the truth finally came out, it wouldn't just destroy Kenneth's plans. It would destroy the last remaining trust anyone still had in him. The phone call from Laura came early Friday morning. I was sitting on the balcony with a cup of coffee when my phone rang. The moment I heard her voice, I knew something had changed. Not because of what she said, because of how she said it. Laura was usually calm, professional, measured. This time, she sounded concerned. "Susan, are you somewhere private?" My stomach immediately tightened. "Wes," there was a brief silence. Then she spoke. "We found something in the emails." I stared out across the parking lot below. "What is it?" Another pause. The apartment wasn't the only thing Kenneth was planning to use. I felt a chill run through me. "What do you mean?" Laura took a breath. "Wa discovered evidence that he listed himself as the future beneficiary on financial projections involving your retirement accounts." For a moment, I didn't understand. The words felt disconnected, then suddenly they weren't. Retirement accounts, savings, inheritance, my future, his plans, everything clicked together at once. I closed my eyes. "Oh my God, I never gained access to the accounts." Laura quickly added. "We found no evidence that he successfully transferred anything." I barely heard her. Because the damage wasn't financial, the damage was emotional. For years while I was cooking meals, babysitting his children, and helping support his family, my son had been calculating my assets, not protecting them. Calculating them, like numbers on a spreadsheet, like pieces of a solution, like resources. I thanked Laura and ended the call. Then I sat there for nearly an hour, thinking, remembering, trying to understand where everything had gone wrong. I remembered teaching Kenneth how to ride a bicycle. I remembered helping him with homework. I remembered sitting beside his hospital bed when he broke his arm at 11 years old. I remembered every birthday, every Christmas, every school play, every proud moment. How had that little boy become this man? The answer came slowly, not all at once, and it wasn't simple. Because people rarely become selfish overnight, they become selfish one decision at a time, one excuse at a time, one shortcut at a time, until eventually they stop seeing other people as people. They start seeing them as opportunities. That evening, Richard invited me to his office. When I arrived, Laura was already there. Several folders sat on the conference table. The atmosphere felt different, more serious, more final. Richard folded his hands. "We've completed our review." I nodded. Part of me wasn't sure I wanted to hear it, but I listened anyway. Over the next hour they walked me through everything: the gambling debts, the unauthorized loans, the forged signatures, the financial projections, the hidden accounts, the collection notices. The timeline stretched back nearly 3 years. 3 years. 3 years of deception. 3 years of secrets. 3 years of decisions Kenneth never told anyone about. Not me, not Sylvia. Nobody. Then Richard handed me another document. I looked down. "What is this?" "A summary of potential legal exposure." The words made my heart sink. How serious? Richard looked directly at me. Very serious. For the first time, I realized something important. I wasn't protecting Kenneth anymore. I was protecting myself. There is a difference. A huge difference. And for years, I had confused the two. When I returned home, the apartment felt unusually tense. Sylvia was waiting. The moment I entered, she stood up. "We need to talk." I nodded. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely frightened. Not angry, not defensive, frightened. She sat across from me. Then she said something I never expected to hear. "I'm sorry." The words hung in the air. I wasn't sure I had heard correctly. "What?" She looked down. "I'm sorry." For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then she continued. "I know I've treated you badly." I remained silent. "I know I've been disrespectful." Still silent. Tears appeared in her eyes. "I thought you were judging me." She laughed bitterly. "Maybe I wanted someone to blame." Part of me wanted to reject the apology. Part of me wanted to remind her of every insult, every cruel comment, every humiliating moment. But another part of me saw something different. A woman discovering that the person she trusted most had lied to her for years. Pain recognizes pain. That doesn't erase responsibility, but it creates understanding. "I appreciate the apology," I finally said. She nodded. Then she whispered something that broke my heart. "I don't know who my husband is anymore." And neither did I. A few days later, everything exploded. Kenneth's creditors finally caught up with him. Calls became daily. Then hourly letters arrived constantly. One collection agency even appeared at his workplace. The pressure became unbearable. The lies could no longer survive. And that's when the truth started reaching the rest of the family. Relatives who had criticized me. Friends who told me I was being harsh. People who insisted I should sacrifice more. One by one, they learned what actually happened. And one by one, they stopped calling. Some apologized. Some avoided me entirely. Others admitted they had judged the situation without knowing the facts. It wasn't satisfying, it was sad. Because none of it had to happen. The following Sunday I gathered everyone in the living room. Kenneth, Sylvia, Emma, Ryan. The atmosphere felt heavy, like the final chapter of something. I looked at my son, he looked exhausted, defeated, broken. And for the first time I realized he knew it too. The lies were over, the excuses were gone, only reality remained. Kenneth, I said quietly. He nodded, tears already filled his eyes. I need you to hear something. The room became completely silent. I love you. He immediately started crying. But loving you doesn't mean protecting you from consequences. He lowered his head. I know. Knew. My voice remained calm. You finally know. For years he had mistaken forgiveness for permission, mercy for weakness, love for unlimited tolerance. Many people make that mistake. Until reality arrives. Then everything changes. And reality had finally arrived. What happened next would determine the rest of his life. Because, within days, Kenneth would be forced to make the most important decision he had ever made. A decision that could either begin his redemption or destroy the last chance he had left. The eviction deadline was now less than 3 weeks away. For the first time since serving the notice, I could see real fear in Kenneth's eyes. Not fear of me, not fear of Sylvia, fear of reality. Reality had finally caught up with him. The collection calls hadn't stopped. The financial documents had exposed years of lies. Relatives who once defended him were now avoiding his phone calls. Most painful of all, Emma and Ryan had started asking questions. Questions he couldn't answer. Questions no parent wants to hear. One evening, I walked into the living room and found Kenneth sitting alone. The television was off. The lights were dim. He looked exhausted, older. Like a man carrying a weight he could no longer hold. When he noticed me, he stood up. Mom. Something in his voice felt different. There was no defensiveness, no excuses, no attempt to change the subject, just exhaustion. Can we talk? I nodded. We sat at opposite ends of the dining table. The same table where he had opened the eviction notice weeks earlier. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Kenneth took a deep breath. I want to tell you everything. I remained silent. This time I wanted the truth, not pieces of it, all of it. He stared down at his hands. It started after I lost my job. I listened. At first, I thought I could fix everything quickly. His voice shook. I told Sylvia not to worry. I already knew where this was going. I borrowed money. He swallowed hard. Then I borrowed more. The story unfolded slowly. One bad decision, then another, then another. At first, he truly believed he could recover. A temporary setback, a temporary loan, a temporary gamble. Temporary. That word again. The same word that had haunted our family for years. But temporary problems have a way of becoming permanent when people refuse to face them. As the debts grew, Kenneth became desperate. As desperation grew, the lies grew. Eventually, he stopped solving problems. He started hiding them. Then he made the worst decision of all, using my information. The moment he admitted it aloud, tears filled his eyes. I knew it was wrong. I believed him. The tragedy wasn't that he didn't know right from wrong. The tragedy was that he chose wrong anyway. Again, and again, and again, until he no longer recognized himself. When he finally finished speaking, the room became silent. The entire confession had taken nearly an hour. An hour of truth, an hour of regret, an hour that should have happened years earlier. Then he looked directly at me, the way he used to when he was a little boy. I'm sorry, Mom. The words sounded genuine. Painfully genuine. And for a moment, I felt my heart break. Not because of what he had done, because of what he had become. I saw flashes of the child I once knew, the teenager who made me laugh, the young man Daniel had been so proud of, all buried beneath years of fear and bad choices. I know you're sorry, I said quietly. He began crying again. But sorry doesn't erase consequences. He nodded. I know. And for the first time, I believed he truly did. The next weekend, the entire family gathered. Not for a celebration, not for a holiday, for the truth. Word had spread. Everyone knew something serious had happened. My sister-in-law came. 2 cousins arrived. Even family members who hadn't visited in years showed up. The atmosphere felt heavy from the moment they entered. Nobody knew exactly what would happen, only that something important was about to change. When everyone was seated, Kenneth stood up. His hands trembled. For several seconds, he couldn't speak. Then he finally began. What followed was one of the hardest things I've ever witnessed. He admitted everything: the gambling, the loans, the lies, the forged signatures, the hidden debts, the assumptions about the apartment, everything. No excuses, no blaming anyone else, no pretending, just truth, raw, painful truth. The room became completely silent. Several relatives looked shocked, others looked heartbroken. A few quietly lowered their eyes, because they remembered criticizing me. They remembered telling me I was too harsh. Now they understood how little they had known. When Kenneth finished, nobody spoke for nearly a minute. Then my sister-in-law finally broke the silence. Suzanne, their tears filled her eyes. We were wrong. Others nodded, one by one, slowly, quietly. No dramatic speeches, no grand gestures, just people realizing they had judged a situation they didn't understand. The apology mattered. But not as much as something else. The truth was finally out. There were no more secrets left, and secrets lose their power once exposed. A week later, the legal consequences began. Richard handled most of the details. Because Kenneth cooperated fully, some matters became easier to resolve. The fraudulent accounts were documented. The unauthorized applications were withdrawn where possible. Credit agencies were notified. The process wasn't quick, and it wasn't painless. But it was necessary. Kenneth accepted responsibility. For the first time in years, he stopped running. That mattered more than he realized. The eviction deadline arrived on a rainy Thursday morning. I woke before sunrise. The apartment felt strangely quiet. Boxes lined the hallway. Furniture had already been moved. Most of Kenneth and Sylvia's belongings were gone. Only a few final items remained. As I walked through the apartment, memories surfaced everywhere. Birthday parties, Christmas mornings, school projects, family dinners. Good memories, painful memories, all mixed together. Life is like that. Nothing is ever completely good or completely bad. By noon, the moving truck arrived. I watched from the window, not with satisfaction, not with anger, with acceptance, because this wasn't revenge. Revenge would have been making them suffer. This was something different. This was accountability. Accountability isn't cruel. It's necessary. As the final boxes disappeared into the truck, Emma ran back inside. She threw her arms around me, tightly. I love you, Grandma. My eyes immediately filled with tears. I love you too, sweetheart. Ryan hugged me next. Neither child fully understood what had happened, but they understood love. Sometimes that's enough. Finally, Kenneth approached. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he surprised me. He handed me a small photograph. I looked down. It was an old picture of Daniel and me. Taken nearly 30 years earlier. We were standing in front of the apartment shortly after buying it. Young, hopeful, happy. I found it in a box, he said quietly. I stared at the photograph. Then back at my son. You should keep it. He shook his head. No. His voice cracked. It belongs here. For several seconds I couldn't speak. Then I carefully accepted the photograph. As I did, I realized something. Justice had arrived. Not through punishment. Not through humiliation. Through truth. The truth had stripped away every lie, every excuse, every illusion, and now everyone could finally see clearly. As Kenneth turned toward the door, he paused. Then he looked back one last time. I hope someday I can earn your trust again. I didn't answer immediately, because trust isn't given, it's earned, slowly, patiently, over time. Finally I nodded. Then start today. He wiped away a tear, then walked out the door. And just like that, the apartment became quiet. For the first time in years. The storm was over. But the final chapter of our story was only beginning. Because over the next year, everything would change. And the ending waiting for all of us was something none of us expected. The first night after Kenneth and his family moved out felt strangely quiet. Too quiet. For years, the apartment had been full of noise. Footsteps in the hallway, cartoons playing in the living room, doors opening and closing, arguments, laughter, life. Now there was only silence. I stood in the middle of the living room and listened. At first, the silence felt lonely. Then something unexpected happened. It felt peaceful. For the first time in years, nobody needed anything from me. Nobody expected me to cook dinner. Nobody expected me to babysit. Nobody expected me to solve a crisis. The apartment belonged to me again, not legally, emotionally. That was the difference. I made myself a cup of tea and sat beside the window. The city lights sparkled in the distance. For the first time in a very long time, I asked myself a question I hadn't considered in years. What do I want? The answer didn't come immediately, because for so long, my life had revolved around everyone else's needs. Widow, mother, grandmother, caretaker, problem solver. I had forgotten that Susan existed beneath all those roles. The next morning I called Mary. My best friend answered on the second ring. Well, she asked. I laughed. Well, what? How does freedom feel? I looked around the apartment. Then I smiled. Terrifying. Mary laughed so hard she nearly dropped the phone. That afternoon, she dragged me out of the apartment, not literally, though she probably would have if necessary. We walked through a local art festival, a place I would normally have avoided because I was always too busy helping someone else. As we wandered between booths, something strange happened. I enjoyed myself, actually enjoyed myself, without guilt, without worry, without checking my phone every 5 minutes. I felt lighter, not younger, just lighter. Over the following months, small changes began appearing in my life. I joined a book club. I started attending community events. I reconnected with former coworkers. Several retired nurses invited me to lunch. For years I had politely declined those invitations. Now I accepted them. And every time I did, I felt a little more like myself. One afternoon, while cleaning out an old closet, I discovered a dusty cardboard box. Inside were travel brochures Daniel and I had saved decades earlier. Places we always planned to visit. Places life had gotten too busy for. I sat on the floor flipping through them. Yellowstone, Maine, Arizona, the Pacific Coast. Dreams postponed, dreams forgotten. Suddenly I heard Daniel's voice in my memory. Not literally, just the memory of something he used to say. One day we'll have time, I smiled sadly. Then I whispered back. I think that day finally arrived. 3 months later, I booked my first trip. A small one. Nothing extravagant. Just a week away. But when the airplane lifted off the runway, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Possibility. Meanwhile, Kenneth's life was very different. Recovery is not a straight line. It's messy, painful, slow. He moved into a small rental apartment. Nothing fancy. Nothing close to what he once imagined. For the first time in his adult life, he had to live within his actual means. No shortcuts, no rescue, no safety net, just reality. At first he hated it. Then something unexpected happened. He began changing, not quickly, not dramatically, but genuinely. He attended counseling, joined a gambling recovery program, started working extra hours. Most importantly, he stopped lying. That sounds simple. It isn't. Honesty becomes difficult when deception becomes a habit. Yet little by little, he started rebuilding, one truthful decision at a time. Sylvia moved out several months later. Not because of another argument, because trust had been shattered. Some things survive betrayal, some don't. Their marriage didn't. Oddly enough, our relationship improved. Not immediately, not magically, but gradually. One afternoon she called and asked if we could meet for coffee. I almost declined. Then curiosity won. We met at a small cafe downtown. For a few awkward minutes, neither of us knew what to say. Finally, Sylvia broke the silence. I owe you another apology. I sighed. Sylvia? No. She shook her head. Let me finish. So I listened. And for the first time, I heard the truth from her side. She admitted she had spent years feeling frustrated. Years feeling trapped. Years blaming everyone except the people actually responsible, including herself. I took it out on you. She looked embarrassed. I know. The honesty surprised both of us. Then something even more surprising happened. We laughed, not because the situation was funny, because it was human, messy, complicated, painful, human. When we finally left the cafe, neither of us pretended everything was fixed. But something important had happened. The bitterness had begun to fade. The grandchildren remained the brightest part of my life. Every Sunday, they visited, sometimes with Kenneth, sometimes with Sylvia, sometimes together, sometimes separately. The arrangement wasn't perfect, but it worked. One afternoon, Emma sat beside me on the couch. At 11 years old, she was becoming remarkably perceptive. Grandma. Yes. Are you still mad at Dad? Children have a way of asking the hardest questions. I thought carefully before answering. She looked surprised. Really, I smiled. No, sweetheart. Then why don't things go back to normal? There it was. The question adults often avoid. I took her hand. Because forgiveness and trust are different things. She frowned, trying to understand. I continued. Forgiveness means letting go of anger. She nodded slowly. Trust means believing someone will make good choices. Another nod. Sometimes forgiveness happens first. She thought about that for a long moment. Then she smiled. I think Dad is trying. So do I. And that was the truth. 1 year after the eviction, something happened that surprised everyone. Kenneth invited the family to dinner. Not at my apartment. At his. The invitation itself felt symbolic. For years, family gatherings had depended on me. Now he wanted to host. To give instead of receive. When I arrived, I immediately noticed the difference. The apartment was modest, simple, nothing luxurious, but it was honest. Every piece of furniture, every bill, every responsibility earned, not borrowed, not assumed, earned. During dinner, Kenneth stood up and tapped his glass. The room became quiet. Then he looked directly at me. His eyes were already filled with emotion. I need to say something. Everyone listened. For a moment, he struggled to find words. Then he finally spoke. A year ago I lost almost everything. The room remained silent. My marriage. A glance toward Sylvia. My reputation. A glance toward relatives. My future. Then he looked at me. And very nearly my mother. My eyes filled with tears. Not because of what he said. Because I could hear the truth behind it. For the first time in years, there were no excuses. No blame, no manipulation, only accountability. And accountability is where real change begins. Kenneth lifted his glass. Mom. His voice cracked. Thank you for saving me by finally refusing to save me. The room became completely silent. And in that moment, I realized something. Sometimes the greatest act of love isn't helping someone avoid consequences. Sometimes it's allowing those consequences to teach the lesson you never could. The story wasn't over yet. There was still one final chapter, one final lesson, and one final conversation that would give this entire journey its meaning. A few weeks after Kenneth's dinner, life settled into something I hadn't experienced in a very long time. Peace. Not perfect peace. Life is never perfect. There were still difficult days. Still painful memories. Still moments when I wondered how different things might have been if certain choices had never been made. But there was peace. The kind that comes when the truth no longer has anywhere to hide. The kind that comes when you stop carrying responsibilities that never belonged to you in the first place. One crisp autumn morning, I found myself standing on the balcony with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise paint the sky shades of gold and orange. It reminded me of something Daniel used to say, "Every day gives you another chance to choose how you'll live." At the time, I never thought much about those words. Now I understood them completely. Because for years, I hadn't really been living. I had been surviving. There is a difference. Surviving is enduring, living is choosing. And after everything that had happened, I was finally choosing again. That afternoon, I received a letter in the mail. At first, I assumed it was another bill or advertisement. Then I recognized the handwriting. Kenneth. I carried it to the kitchen table and sat down. Slowly, I opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter, not an email, not a text message, a real letter, the kind people write when something truly matters. As I read, tears slowly filled my eyes. The letter wasn't asking for money. It wasn't asking for forgiveness. It wasn't asking for anything. It was simply the truth. He wrote about the shame he felt, the damage he had caused, the people he had hurt, the years he had wasted blaming circumstances instead of accepting responsibility. Most importantly, he admitted something I never expected to hear. He admitted that the apartment had never really been what he wanted. Not deep down. What he wanted was security. What he wanted was certainty. What he wanted was someone to rescue him from every bad decision, and for too many years, that person had been me. Near the end of the letter, one sentence stood out above all the others. I spent years believing you were standing in my way, when the truth was that you were the only thing standing between me and complete disaster. I read that sentence 3 times. Then I folded the letter and placed it beside Daniel's photograph. Some words deserved to be kept. Months passed, winter arrived. Then spring. Life continued moving forward. Kenneth remained committed to rebuilding his life. He stayed in recovery, continued counseling, paid down debt, worked hard, slowly, painfully, responsibly. Trust wasn't restored overnight. But little by little, brick by brick, he began rebuilding it. Not through promises, through actions. That's the only way trust ever returns. One action at a time, one choice at a time, one day at a time. As for Sylvia, she surprised me more than anyone. She built a successful career, focused on the children, and over time, she became someone I genuinely respected. Not because she was perfect, because she finally became honest. One afternoon, nearly 2 years after the eviction, she joined me for lunch. As we sat together, she shook her head and laughed. "You know something." "What?" She smiled. "I used to think you were the stubborn one." I laughed. "Only used to." She laughed too. Then her expression softened. "I really was awful to you." I smiled gently. "You weren't the only one making mistakes." She nodded. "Maybe that was why we got along better now. Neither of us was pretending anymore." Pain has a strange way of stripping away illusions, and sometimes what's left behind is surprisingly genuine. The grandchildren grew older. Emma started high school. Ryan became obsessed with basketball. Every birthday, every holiday, every family gathering became another reminder that healing is possible. Not easy, not quick, but possible. Then came the moment that truly brought everything full circle. It happened on an ordinary Sunday afternoon. Nothing special, no holiday, no celebration. Just family gathered around my dining table. The same table where I had once placed the white envelope that changed everything. The same table where secrets had been exposed. The same table where consequences had begun. Now it was filled with laughter, conversation, life. At one point, Emma looked around the room and smiled. "You know what's funny?" Everyone looked at her. "What?" She pointed at the table. This is where everything changed. The room became quiet, not uncomfortable, thoughtful. Then Ryan nodded. Yeah. Kenneth lowered his eyes. Sylvia smiled softly, and I looked at the table that had witnessed both the worst and best moments of our family. The realization hit me all at once. The white envelope had never been about revenge. Not really. It had been about truth, because families don't fall apart when the truth comes out. Families fall apart when the truth stays hidden. The envelope didn't destroy our family. The lies did. The envelope simply forced everyone to face reality, and reality, painful as it was, gave us a chance to rebuild. Later that evening, after everyone left, I remained alone in the kitchen. I washed the final dish, dried my hands, and glanced toward the window. For a brief moment I saw my reflection. Older than before, wiser than before, stronger than before. I thought about the frightened woman standing at this same sink years earlier, when Sylvia whispered those cruel words. You old witch. I only put up with you because of my husband. Back then, those words felt like an ending. Now I understood they were actually a beginning. Because that insult forced me to remember something I should never have forgotten. Respect isn't something you beg for, it's something you require. Love isn't sacrifice without limits, and kindness isn't permission for others to use you. I turned off the kitchen light, picked up Daniel's photograph, and smiled. Then I whispered the lesson that had taken me 65 years to fully understand. The moment I stopped letting people take advantage of my love was the moment I finally learned how much I was worth. And with that, I closed the door behind me. Not as a victim, not as a survivor, but as the owner of my life once again.